From underground dungeons to modern high-tech security cells, from workhouses to work details, from heavy leg irons to electronic bracelets. These are the ways society over the centuries has dealt with crime through punishment. Now, prisons on Modern Marvels. Today, 8 million people are behind bars around the world, 2 million in the United States alone. Some are housed in high-tech maximum security fortresses. Others are in more medieval-looking structures. Inmates are also secured inside prison walls through a variety of sophisticated technology.
I think technology is the key to the future. You've got to give officers, in jail and prison systems anywhere in this country, the key behind their success is giving the officers the tools necessary to do their job. A lot of that is about technology.
Microwave sensors use a transmitter that emits high-frequency radio waves between itself and a receiver. The waves form an invisible electric field. Anything entering that field disturbs the waves, which weakens the signal to the receiver and triggers an alarm. Robots equipped with explosives can blow up walls in prison riots or hostage situations.
A lot of technology has been developed just for the correctional industry, but a lot of the development that has come out of defense activities has been now applied to the correctional industry.
The toughest and most incorrigible inmates are housed in super maximum security prison units, which generally have the most advanced technology.
Supermax facilities have evolved as a concept in the last 10 years to deal with some of the most problematic inmates in the system, to get them out of the rest of the facilities in the system. So we're just going to get them in an environment where we can really batten down the hatches, keep close control, and not worry about them infecting the rest of the population.
California has the majority of high-security inmates. In 1990, it unveiled a state-of-the-art maximum security housing unit at Pelican Bay State Prison. It became a model for the rest of the country. Its X-shaped security housing unit was a high-tech replica of the nation's earliest prisons, featuring solitary confinement cells. The inmate sits in a windowless cell with a poured concrete sleeping slab and an immobile concrete or steel toilet behind a thick steel-plated door. Corrections officers monitor him from control booths with video cameras and communicate through speakers.
Supermax, you typically feed an inmate in their cell. That means designing a food pass in the cell door or off to the side so that the officer will come by. The food will be pre-portioned, put in a tray, inserted in the cell, collected after a certain period of time.
Today's high-tech Supermax may be a far cry from security measures used at the earliest prisons. But throughout history, society's views on how to treat criminals can be summed up by the barriers built to house them.
It's a worthy history to study, and it tells us who we are as a people. You can use a metaphor of the wall and the anti-wall. The people who believe in more confinement, more retribution, in more punishment, as being the people of the wall. And you can think of the people who would like to eliminate walls, would like to open up the spaces, would like to have opportunities for rehabilitations as the anti-war.
For prisons, certainly beginning in the 17th century, you did have a modest wall around them. Later, the walls increased in height and security. In the 1950s and 60s, in the United States at least, the wall became too expensive to build. They began to use cyclone fences and razor wire coils, and later on, electronic devices.
What the public expects from prison today is really the sense that the people inside are going to stay inside. They go back to their images from the James Cagney movies, and this real sense that once that door closed behind somebody, it was with a sense of finality.
Before the 18th century, prisons were nothing more than holding cells where criminals waited to be tried. They were sentenced to death, mutilated, branded, or banished to another country.
For the most part, before the 18th century, the method of punishing felons was corporal punishment, various forms of corporal punishment, capital punishment.
Prisoners were held in crude dungeons for short periods of time until their punishment. Some were detained with a garrote, or iron collar that would be locked around their neck to disable or torture them. If tightened, they would strangle to death.
Before the 18th century, prison design was almost an afterthought. Various structures that were built for other purposes were adapted for use as holding cells, but had not been designed initially with the intention of making them prisons.
The first known system of prisons was a series of dungeons built above the main sewers in Rome between the 3rd and 1st centuries BC. Here, prisoners were confined in large rooms. From the 4th century and until the Renaissance, the Roman Catholic Church contributed greatly to the evolution of the prison. Throughout Europe and in England, church authorities imprisoned both clergy and lay people who violated canon law. They were housed in monasteries and abbeys.
If monks committed very serious offenses such as arson or murder, there were underground rooms where the monk would be confined permanently, and religious tracts and food would be lowered to him.
I think the most important thing that is drawn from the precedents of the medieval world, and particularly later on Elizabethan England and 18th century England and London, is the whole idea of the notion of the cell. And I think it draws on the monastic tradition particularly, that this is a place where one is isolated, compelled to turn into the self and reflect on the self.
This was the beginning of prison design, which centuries later would be referred to as solitary confinement. In theory, it was meant to rehabilitate an inmate through isolation and prayer instead of physical punishment. Prisoners were confined to their locked cells. Secular prisons began to emerge as early as the 12th century with the rise of civil governments in Europe and the development of public law.
Castles and fortresses always were built with strong rooms on lower levels to store material in case the castle was under siege. Those rooms could be used later, particularly when castles had no military value. They could be used to house prisoners.
Ruling monarchs used castles such as the Tower of London or France's Bastille to lock away political rivals. By the 15th century, the breakup of feudalism and the expansion of cities caused much economic and social turmoil. Work was scarce. Many became homeless, turning to begging, stealing, and prostitution. Acts the English government deemed as criminal. To deal with these new lawbreakers, the English built workhouses.
The houses of correction were called bridewells because the king had donated a sort of rundown palace called the Bridewell Palace, and that became a workhouse. Street people, vagabonds, prostitutes, and petty thieves were put in there, not in cells, but in rooms.
In those rooms, prisoners manufactured various products under strict discipline.
Prisoners worked hard, and here the idea of reform came in.
But not all European countries adopted the workhouse concept. Some turned to distant outposts of civilization overseas, such as Australia, North Africa, and free American colonies like Delaware and Maryland. Such penal colonies existed until the mid-1900s.
It was a lot cheaper for European governments in the late 18th and early 19th centuries to send miscreants to the colonies. Now, in some cases, they were actual penal colonies that people were sent to, such as Devil's Island.
Devil's Island in South America's French Guiana was legendary for its horrendous conditions and brutal physical punishment. It was a humid jungle known for its hard labor, insect-infested cells, and starving prisoners. But even banishment to other countries, workhouses, and traditional prisons could not keep up with England's growing inmate population. Its solution was to incarcerate prisoners on derelict warships and merchant vessels, called hulks. The ships were anchored in waterways throughout Britain. As many as 5,000 convicts were imprisoned at any given time. Conditions aboard the ships were filthy, crowded, and disease-ridden.
And by all accounts, those inmates were in even more miserable conditions than were those in local jails.
Some hulks were no longer seaworthy. They took on so much water that inmates living in their lower decks drowned. Prisoners wore leg irons and handcuffs. It is thought to be one of the first times a ball and chain was also put to use.
The ships ultimately were not workable.
Though hulks vanished after the late 1800s, the concept resurfaced recently in a more civilized way. Rikers Island in New York City housed its overflow inmate population on ferries in the 1990s.
We still have today 2 of those boats on the island or attached to the island. They hold 162 inmates each. And although they're out of commission right now, within a week's time, they could be reactivated as swing space for the agency if we needed them.
Back in the mid-1800s, when hulks failed, there was a radical movement to make landlocked prisons more secure. When we return, how architectural styles determined a prisoner's reform or retribution. The United States leads all countries with the most people behind bars, nearly 1/4 of the world's prison population. Prisons will continue in a moment on Modern Marvels. Back in the mid-1800s, a wave of architectural reform swept through prisons. Englishman Jeremy Bentham proposed new designs to make prisons more secure and easily managed. One of the popular designs Bentham instituted was called the Panopticon Plan.
And the arrangement of these prisons had to be that the governor could look from the windows of his central hub house into all the cells that radiated like spokes of a wheel from that center. And the idea was that he could keep an eye not only on the inmates but also on the guards. It didn't work very well.
The Panopticon design didn't work because the architecture made it impossible for the governor to see all areas of the institution from his office. In America, a prominent doctor named Benjamin Rush had other ideas about what a prison should look like. He believed prisons should remove not only the dangerous people from society, but also they should try to reform inmates into law-abiding citizens. With that in mind, the Quakers helped establish the first true prison in America, called the Walnut Street Jail, a place where inmates would do penance. Hence the term penitentiary was created.
It consisted of a series of large rooms, but as the Walnut Street Jail became seriously overcrowded, they planned to build a large prison, now a state prison.
This resulted in the construction of Eastern State Penitentiary in Philadelphia, which adopted the Quaker philosophy of punishment by solitary confinement. It later became known as the Pennsylvania system. Eastern was a radical departure in prison architecture. This floor plan shows its radial cell block design.
So the design was set up in this hub and spoke manner in order to improve supervision of the inmates and thereby prevent escapes.
The philosophy behind Eastern was to keep the inmates separate from each other, to prevent them from forming gangs and organizing riots or escapes. When a prisoner first arrived, he was escorted to his cell with a hood over his head, so that he could not see the other prisoners or where he was going, and they in turn could not see him.
The prison was designed in the way it was to ensure that the prison could carry out its philosophy of solitary confinement for all of the inmates.
By 1820 standards, Eastern was massive, with nearly 11 acres inside its walls. The outside wall was 1/2 mile around and 8 feet thick at the base. Eastern was one of the first prisons to build towers. The front building was 200 feet long, with a square tower turret at each end. It also had a guard tower on the roof of its central rotunda.
The cells were quite large enough that an inmate would not only have his living space, but also room for a workbench, a loom, machinery, tools, raw materials, whatever he needed in order to do his assigned work, which could be everything from weaving or dyeing cloth, making shoes, caning chairs, things of this nature. It all was done in the individual cell.
But the hub and spoke architecture of Eastern Penitentiary had many design flaws.
It was expensive to design, build, and operate a prison of this kind because the rooms, the individual cells, had to be so large. And also because having the inmates by themselves, working by themselves, they could not take advantage of the techniques of factory production. So there was less opportunity to make money for the inmates to produce revenue for the institution.
A different approach towards prisons was taken in neighboring New York. Authorities there abandoned the solitary confinement approach and built a prison in Auburn, New York in 1825 that housed convicts together. It was called the Auburn or Congregate Silent System. The most well-known and one of the first prisons to create this system was Sing Sing, north of New York City on the Hudson River. The prison became known for the terms up the river and the big house.
If you're going to have the men work in congregate, that is, in a group setting, and the reason that was chosen here is because it was productive and cost-effective. Contracts could be let, inmates could be organized into shops. Those shops would be monitored by supervisors appointed by the contractor. The state was in favor of that because it generated revenues. Those revenues offset the cost of the institution. The state thought also it was preparing men with the skills necessary to serve in the outside world.
One of those skills was construction work. In 1825, New York State had the inmates who would be sentenced to live in Sing Sing build the prison from limestone in a nearby quarry. It took them 3 years.
This is a work that had a very strange reward. As the cell walls got higher and the cell blocks got more finished, there must have been a sense of completing one's own imprisonment. I think there was some sense of justice in that.
Sing Sing's cell block was 476 feet long, 4 tiers high, and had more than 800 cells. Cell blocks consisted of long multi-tiered double rows of cells that were placed back to back. The cells were so small, many inmates had to walk in sideways.
Because the inmates were out of the cells during the day, and they were working in a congregate type of environment, either in one of the shops or in the quarries. And at night, they would go back to their cells, and the idea with cells, you could sleep, and you didn't need to do anything pretty much else besides do that.
The cells were 3 feet wide and 7 feet deep. They had no running water and only a bucket for a toilet. For more than 100 years, it was Sing Sing's main cell block. In 1926, when bank robber Willie Sutton served time there, he wrote, "Very little sunlight penetrated the block, and the only ventilation was through the pattern of 1-inch square holes in the doors." This is all that remains of Sing Sing's original cell block today.
They realized that they could put more inmates in a given space if they stacked them on top of each other. So they built cells on top of cells.
To control the swinging grill doors from a central location at the end of the tier, there's this device at the top of the cells. In later years, a new locking technology appeared, which was less vulnerable to tampering. It let staff open 50 cells at one time by pulling a lever. It was safer and more efficient for prison staff.
The advantage was that you could open all the cells at the same time. It was a new thing. You didn't have to individually key lock or key open each cell, which is what you had to do before that.
But if an officer had to open a cell individually, he would use a 5-inch long paracentric key. It has grooves which cover over the center of the key. It originated in the early 1900s to open the lever tumbler lock. Some prisons, like Sing Sing, still use it today. The paracentric key was later upgraded to today's oversized style, called a Maxi Mogul key. It is used for pin tumbler locks at more modern prisons and is harder for inmates to replicate. Sing Sing was one of the first prisons to require that inmates wear the traditional black and white striped uniform. It was considered a security measure.
If somebody escaped, you knew they were an inmate, unless they could find some other clothes to wear.
Inmates at Sing Sing were also secured with leg irons that were 5 feet long and weighed 25 pounds each. But despite the restraints, they still managed to find ways to escape from Sing Sing. The most popular was by hopping the fence and catching the train, which ran and still runs through the prison grounds. They were always captured eventually.
If recapture was so certain, why in fact did they persist 2 and 3 a week? And the reason was because I think it was an act of resistance, in which when the whistle blew here in the 19th century announcing an inmate had attempted to escape, there was enormous cheer from the population. All kinds of obscenities would be heard, and the roar lasted for several minutes. And everybody knew that tomorrow they would see him again. But what they really knew was that somebody had stood up to the system.
Sing Sing was a model for prisons around the world. It was legendary for its electric chair. The phrase "the last mile" originated here. 600 inmates were electrocuted at Sing Sing, including the most famous, A-bomb spies Julius and Ethel Rosenberg.
I'm doing life, 199 years, so no pardon, no parole. And you can't crash over those walls in a million years. The only chance is to get to the courthouse and try it from there.
And where do I come in?
Sing Sing's intimidating facade made it a favorite location for Hollywood directors in their prison movies.
Many of the 19th century prisons were built with a massive Bastille-like cell block design in order to be intimidating, to demonstrate the power of the state, to scare people away, and to show the inmates who went there that they were going into a very intimidating, unpleasant sort of a place.
The number of inmates returning to prison after committing new offenses made it clear to authorities that the harshness of incarceration did not deter crime. When we return, how the government imprisoned the nation's toughest inmates. At the time it was constructed in the 1820s, Eastern State Penitentiary was the most expensive building in the United States. Cost $770,000. Prisons will continue on Modern Marvels. As unsatisfactory as prisons may have been for men in the early 20th century, they were far worse for women. Typically, female prisoners spent their time in basements, attics, and corners of male prisons. An English Quaker, Elizabeth Gertie Fry, believed that female offenders could be rehabilitated, but only if they were isolated from the corrupting influence of men, by keeping them in prisons for females only, run by a female staff. Women prisoners had work assignments in home-like settings. Cottages or dormitories replaced the traditional cell blocks.
And the notion of these as institutions without walls probably has a lot to do with the so-called cottage system. They look like small towns. They would have a commons, a large open public space. The cottages would be clustered around each other. There would also be usually a common dining hall.
The success of the cottage system led to other women's institutions, which provided religious and vocational guidance. Like the women, black inmates in the South also worked in the early 20th century, but not necessarily to be rehabilitated. Many states leased inmates to work on farms and help build highways, mostly in the South. The convicts got the name chain gangs because their ankles were chained together as they worked. In the 1920s and 30s, the nation experienced a crime wave related to the failure of Prohibition and the rise of gangsters. The public demanded hoodlums like Al Capone and Machine Gun Kelly be locked up in an escape-proof prison. In 1934, the Federal Bureau of Prisons sent these criminals to a newly remodeled former military prison on an island in San Francisco Bay called Alcatraz.
They took that prison and made it a very secure prison. The prison, of course, was very expensive to run. It was an old physical plant.
Over the years, Alcatraz had its share of prison myths and high-profile residents. One of them was convicted killer Robert Stroud, the notorious Birdman of Alcatraz. Prison staff say he had a Jekyll and Hyde personality and was far from being the gentle scientist portrayed in the movies. They say he didn't even like birds. He only raised them as a way of hiding various weapons. Alcatraz was the answer at the time to an important correctional solution. Authorities recognized that it was a small number of inmates, less than 1% of the entire prison population, that posed such serious management problems that whole prisons had to be devoted to controlling them. The result was to create the nation's first super maximum security prison and lock up all the worst criminals there without an attempt at rehabilitation.
They retrofitted it, put in new tamper-resistant bars, took out the old-fashioned strap iron bars, put in new locking devices, made it a much more secure facility than it had been before.
But still, that did not prevent escapes. During its 30 years of operation, Alcatraz saw more than a dozen escapes. None were considered successful. Many were attributed to the prison's deteriorating conditions.
Obviously, if you're in the middle of a bay and salt water and you're a concrete facility, you're going to have some deterioration. But that was the technology that was available at the time that was built.
It was so costly to repair Alcatraz that the government closed the prison in 1963. But its closure led quickly to the creation of more and greater super maximum security prisons.
So although it was picturesque and it captured everybody's imagination, it was abandoned, and they began to build from the ground up a high-security prison in Marion, Illinois.
The federal penitentiary in Marion was a structure designed in the telephone pole style of architecture. This called for its cell blocks, workshops, recreational facilities, chapels, and dining areas to extend from each side of a long central corridor. Unlike Alcatraz, rehabilitation of inmates was reestablished as a goal of imprisonment. But its philosophy was short-lived.
Marion had tremendous gang problems and had tremendous violence problems within their facility.
The violence escalated in Marion as well as many prisons across the country. In the late 1960s, the political culture of civil disobedience and non-negotiable demands led to more than 100 prison outbreaks in 1969 and 1970 alone. The most famous riot occurred in 1971 at Attica State Prison in western New York. 11 officers and 32 inmates were killed. Michigan State Prison in Jackson endured several riots. A series of assaults and deaths on staff and inmates occurred at Marion. The prison was put on permanent lockdown status in 1983. It became the nation's first prison to create a super maximum security unit where incorrigible inmates were housed in a single cell for 23 hours a day. When corrections authorities around the country saw how successful Marion was in reducing violence, almost every state created high security units.
In the early to mid-60s, there was a real focus on rehabilitation and rehabilitative environments. More recently, we've moved more towards a approach to warehousing and building harder and harder facilities. In some ways in response to what the population is we're dealing with today, and in other ways simply in response to what public concerns are about what prisons are.
The warehouse-like structures of Supermax units today have high-tech features and modern cell designs, as well as more correctional officers.
So this typically involves smaller housing units rather than larger ones. Let's say you take someone because they have a visit with their attorney or family. There would be 2 officers to accompany that inmate. And they have a walkway above the regular corridor that looks down. It's a grate. There's an officer above with a weapon and tear gas in case there's a problem. So they would actually have a separate secure corridor system that an officer will walk in to accommodate that.
Since its creation, the Supermax has become one of the fastest growing types of prisons built in America.
I think what the public expects to see is something which clearly tells the public that they're safe, that the people that are inside aren't going to get outside. You know, if we go back historically, our hardest prisons were the walled institutions with towers, the Bastille kind of prison. Today, that's really been approached by, double fences, multiple coils of razor ribbon, perimeter detection systems.
The Supermax prisons now make no pretense at reform. That is, it's considered a quarantine to protect the staff and the inmates from their behavior.
Preventing inmates at Supermax and other prisons from escaping requires special security systems. When we return, the latest in prison technology. More than 16,000 inmates live in super maximum security units in the United States. Prisons will return on Modern Marvels. Imprisonment today, as it did 200 years ago, means separation from the free world. But the methods of keeping that separation have become more technological and specific in design.
What we focus on when we design a prison is really security in 3 areas. Obviously, the primary mission is the security of the public. But equally important is the safety of the staff. We like to think of the staff as somebody that's sentenced there to serve a life sentence, 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, for as long as they're with the system. And finally, the safety of the inmate, which is also the responsibility of the state who's operating the facility.
What's important in prison design is that it makes it easy for officers to see inmates in a cell block. Some architects provide 3D computer animation to prison authorities before construction, so that they can confirm that the structure being built will serve their needs.
Well, one of the important things in designing a facility, a correctional facility, is for the officers, they're supposed to be supervising what is going on. The primary way we do that is to make sure they can see everything. Second thing is acoustically being able to hear. In a housing unit, we try to design these so that an officer in a unit can kind of be aware of what's going on around him just in terms of noise level, activity levels. If a fight breaks out or a scuffle, he can hear that, he can respond to it immediately.
The most common approach to maximum visual design is a central control room.
Basically, the officer is in a glass room that has remote controls and remote communication into housing units.
This design is called a pod. The officer sits at the center, surrounded by cells on both sides. Surveillance cameras line the cell blocks.
As a result of the riots that were taking place across the country in the 70s, there were changes in the designing for what is the most useful number of inmates to have in any housing area, and what is the best way to arrange the configuration. And around the country, you'll see the podular units.
The design and construction of cells have also changed. Some jails, like Rikers Island in New York City, use cells that are prefabricated in a factory in Pennsylvania. They are made of concrete and steel and are delivered by truck in units which consist of 2 cells joined by a plumbing and electrical closet. The cell units are hoisted by crane into a prepared steel structure, which is the framework of the jail. The precast construction also serves as a safety feature by making it almost impossible for an inmate to break off any part of the cell to fashion a weapon. Next to the cell is a safety feature that provides security for prison staff, should the cell have a maintenance problem.
In the past, If we had a plumbing problem in a cell or a flood, we had to shut down a string of cells. This advantage allows us to work directly with that individual cell for plumbing and electrical problems without closing off cells or removing inmates out of the adjacent cells while we do repairs.
Outside, today's penitentiaries are now surrounded by a new, more lethal generation of the old barbed wire, razor ribbon wire. Usually it is surrounded by a new version of a perimeter fence that is now electronically upgraded with taut wire. The wire is double braided with a breaking strength of 950 pounds. It is attached to steel posts, anchored into the ground. It is connected to a device called a tensioner, which keeps the wires tight to 65 pounds of force. If the wires are cut or tampered with, the sensors set off an alarm. If an inmate attempts to escape, alarms will pick up a signal that goes to a central control room, which dispatches an officer.
But with the advent of technology, we were able to install electronic sensors around the perimeter fence, so that now we can take the officers out of the guard towers, use their talents in other ways.
Facilities such as the Arizona State Prison in Lewis also use buried sensor cables which transmit electromagnetic energy. If an intruder is in the area, an alarm goes off instantly at the central control station. Sensors such as the microwave intrusion link can detect intruders from as far away as 1,500 feet. Despite all the high-tech devices at prisons today, inmates with time on their hands do manage to outsmart officers and technology.
You know, when I worked in Illinois, we had 3 very dangerous gang members walk right out the front door. They worked in the clothing room, and our process was to give an individual a suit of clothes upon release, and so they made clothes, and they made an extra set, and during a tour, they just joined the tour and walked right out.
While officers are always on the lookout for schemes that help inmates break through to the outside, when we return, we'll look at how technology works to control inmates on the inside. A unit of 2 prefabricated cells weighs nearly 26 tons. Each cell costs about $9,500 to build and install. Prisons will continue on Modern Marvels. Breaking into prison is almost as hard as breaking out. In many institutions, biometric devices, technology which uses parts of the body, are now in use. The hand geometry device electronically reads a handprint on a computer. The prison gate will only open for those whose handprints are in its system. Eyes can also be used to identify prison staff or inmates.
The iris scan biometric device is a device that actually takes a picture of the iris. It then looks at the patterns of the iris and correlates those patterns to a previously recorded pattern of that particular individual. If the correlation is a positive or a match, then it authorizes the event to take place, which is typically maybe opening a door.
Eyes are also part of the technology inside prisons. Correctional officers now have a way to distract inmates during a riot with a device called the Laser Dazzler. It's a bright laser light that can temporarily blind an inmate and make him nauseous. And in order to eliminate a cell search, a sophisticated detector can trace fingerprints or small particles from narcotics in a cell just by wiping a surface. But when officers are shut out of a cell block during a riot or hostage situation, they can now tape what's going on inside as it's going on with the help of television technology called a video multiplex. It can show 16 cameras at once throughout the prison. The camera system can be linked to a phone line, so if one screen shows problems at a particular location in the prison, authorities can call into that camera, hear what's going on, and communicate. Officers can also see what's going on in a darkened cell block during a riot with a device called Tiger Vision. It's a night imaging camera that allows them to record what they see without using a light. And to keep inmates under control, the latest in restraints is this Velcro ankle bracelet, which comes with a matching shoulder harness. Today, prisons can control individual cells at a central panel. Not only can correctional officers open and close cell doors by the touch of a computer screen, they can also control the flow of water in an inmate's toilet.
So we developed technology that allowed us to control how many times a toilet would flush, when it would become inactive, when we wanted to flush it from a remote location. If we felt an inmate was storing urine and feces in his toilet so that he could throw it on a staff member, we could remotely flush that toilet. If an inmate has been involved in flooding the pod, we could control how many times that toilet could be flushed from a central location.
At Rikers Island, correctional officers use an electronic immobilization shield, which sends 50,000 volts of electricity to temporarily stun an uncontrollable inmate.
Prior to 1995, if there was a problem with an inmate in the cell, the method of removing that inmate was to send a 5-man probe team in and physically fight the inmate to get him removed from the cell.
Now, instead of strip searching an inmate for weapons, the body orifice security system, or BOSS chair, can detect any metal objects an inmate might hide anywhere on the body.
Innovative things like that have been a very successful tool to sending a clear message to the inmates that you can't possess weapons. If they're caught with a weapon looking through the BOSS chair system, they're charged with the crime of bringing contraband and possessing contraband in the system.
When there's a violation of a prison security system, authorities react quickly to correct it. Prison officials are also quick to change technology at their institutions when a breach of security occurs. In 1997, a correctional officer at the Arizona State Prison in Perryville was stabbed to death by an inmate who was able to unlock his cell door.
So they could actually spin the lock by just putting something in the lock, spinning it, and it released the door. After we had the incident, we went back and changed those devices.
The Arizona Department of Corrections changed the cell locks as well as those on control room doors, so they would automatically lock behind a correctional officer without a key. Because of extreme overcrowding and the huge costs of operating prisons today, a method of confining minor offenders outside prison is underway. It's basically a system of house arrest. An offender lives at home with an electronic bracelet strapped to his ankle. The bracelet sends out radio signals to a small receiver located in his home and workplace. The receiver transmits a signal to a computer in a monitoring center, which has the offender's exact schedule so authorities can keep track of him. It is the ultimate high-tech concept of prison without walls.
The history of correction in the United States can be told in the struggle that goes on and still goes on between the forces of the wall and the forces of anti-war. And general common reasoning in our society is that one solution does not fit all. So the wall has its purpose and its value.
In the years to come, society will look to a new generation of correctional officers, architecture, and technology to create more positive chapters in prison history. Looking back on the past hopefully will help prison authorities capture new insights and lessons for controlling